My beloved child, something shifted quietly the moment a third party discovered the promise your soulmate had made about you, because what they uncovered was not a careless sentence spoken in passing, not a temporary emotion, and not something your soulmate intended for anyone else to hear. It was a promise made during a private moment when there was nothing to gain from pretending, and now that someone else knows about it, your soulmate has been forced to look at those words again and decide whether they were merely beautiful words, or the beginning of something they are finally ready to prove through action. Don't skip, because the most important part of this story is not that the promise was discovered. It is what your soulmate did immediately afterward. There was an ordinary moment earlier when everything still seemed normal. A phone rested nearby. A conversation had been moving casually from one subject to another. Nothing about the room suggested that a hidden truth was seconds away from surfacing. Your soulmate was listening more than speaking, answering carefully, carrying that familiar calm expression people wear when they do not want anyone looking too deeply beneath the surface. Then one sentence changed the entire atmosphere. The third party mentioned you. Not dramatically. Not accusingly. Just your name woven into a question that seemed almost harmless. Yet your soulmate became unusually still. There are moments when silence says more than a paragraph ever could, and this was one of them. The third party noticed. They had expected a casual answer, perhaps a laugh, perhaps a quick dismissal, but instead they saw your soulmate glance away as though a memory had suddenly returned with perfect clarity. What memory could make someone react like that? Stay with this, because that question became the doorway to everything that followed. Your soulmate remembered a night that no one else knew mattered. It had been much quieter than the dramatic scenes people imagine when they think about promises. There had been no crowd, no celebration, no perfect speech prepared in advance. Your soulmate had simply been alone with their thoughts, thinking about you differently than they had allowed themselves to before. Maybe there was a photograph nearby. Maybe an old message was still sitting on the screen. Maybe they had reread something you once said that seemed ordinary when you said it, yet somehow carried more meaning with time. And in that private silence, your soulmate made a decision about you. Not a decision that demanded anything from you. Not a promise that tried to control your future. It was something far more grounded. They promised themselves that if the moment ever came when they were given an honest opportunity to show you what you truly meant to them, they would stop hiding behind hesitation. They would stop allowing uncertainty to speak louder than sincerity. They would stop waiting for the perfect moment and begin creating an honest one. That was the secret promise. Yet the third party did not know the full wording at first. They only knew enough to realize that your soulmate had been carrying an intention involving you for far longer than anyone suspected. And suddenly the casual conversation no longer felt casual. You actually meant that? The third party asked. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. Their fingers moved toward the phone, then stopped. Something was happening inside them that had nothing to do with embarrassment. It was recognition. Because hearing someone else mention the promise made it real in a new way. It was one thing to carry an intention privately. It was another to hear it reflected back from someone standing in front of you. And maybe you understand that feeling. Sometimes you can live with a truth inside your heart for months because nobody asks you to define it. But when someone finally says, Is this what you really want? Suddenly avoidance becomes much harder. Your soulmate had reached that moment. The third party expected them to retreat. Perhaps they even assumed the promise had been made emotionally and forgotten later. But your soulmate surprised them. They said very quietly, "I remember exactly what I said." Something important changed in the room after that. The third party leaned back. Your soulmate looked down at the screen again. And an old message connected to you was still there. Not necessarily romantic. Not necessarily dramatic. Maybe it was something simple you once wrote, an honest thought, a small encouragement, a sentence showing kindness when you had no idea how deeply it would be remembered. Your soulmate scrolled upward. Then downward. Then stopped at one particular exchange. They had visited that message before. More than once. Yet this time they were not reading it through nostalgia. They were reading it while asking themselves a difficult question: if I meant the promise, why am I still waiting? Notice what makes this moment different. Nobody was forcing your soulmate forward. The third party did not command them to act. You were not standing there demanding an answer. The pressure came from the gap between what your soulmate had once promised themselves and what they had actually done. That gap had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Something important is waiting for you in this story, because this is where the situation turns in a direction the third party never expected. Instead of defending themselves, your soulmate began explaining why the promise had existed in the first place. They spoke about the way you had entered their thoughts without trying. About moments when they caught themselves wondering whether you were doing well. About the strange calm they associated with certain memories of you. About conversations that ended hours earlier but somehow continued in their mind afterward. They admitted something even they had struggled to put into words: what mattered about you was not one dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of small ones. Your tone when you were being sincere. The way you carried yourself after disappointment. The moments you probably thought nobody noticed. The strength you showed quietly instead of announcing it. The way you sometimes gave more understanding than people realized. Those were the things that stayed. And that is why the promise had been made. Your soulmate had realized that if life ever opened a genuine door between you again, they did not want to enter it halfway. But here is what the third party asked next, and this question struck much deeper: what exactly are you waiting for? Your soulmate had no immediate answer. The room became quiet again. Outside, ordinary life continued. Someone passed by. A notification appeared and disappeared. A distant sound came from another room. Yet inside that silence, your soulmate saw something clearly for the first time. They had been calling their hesitation patience. They had been calling their uncertainty timing. They had been waiting for some unmistakable signal that would remove every possibility of awkwardness, rejection, misunderstanding, or imperfection. But real life rarely offers that kind of certainty. Meaningful conversations often begin while people are still nervous. Important decisions are often made before every question is answered. Your soulmate suddenly understood that keeping a sincere promise did not require knowing exactly how everything would unfold. It only required taking the next honest step. And then they did something small. almost disappointingly small if you were expecting fireworks. They opened the notes on their phone. The third party watched without understanding. Your soulmate began typing. One line. Then erased it. Another line. Erased that too. They placed the phone down, rubbed their hand across their face, then picked it up again. Why was something so simple suddenly so difficult? Because this was no longer fantasy. This was movement. For a long time, your soulmate could imagine someday speaking openly with you while remaining completely safe inside imagination. Writing the first real sentence changed that. It created possibility. And possibility is beautiful precisely because it contains no guarantee. The third party finally asked what they were writing. Your soulmate answered, "Something I should have said properly a long time ago." Stay till the end, because what happened next was not about sending a dramatic confession. Your soulmate understood that approaching you with overwhelming declarations would contradict the very thing they respected about this connection. The promise was never to arrive loudly. It was to arrive honestly. So they began again. Slowly. Their first words acknowledged something simple. They had been thinking about a conversation between you. They wanted to say something clearly instead of leaving it implied. Then they stopped again. The third party expected uncertainty to win. It didn't. Your soulmate locked the phone and stood up. That surprised the third party even more. "You're not sending it?" they asked. Your soulmate shook their head. "Not like this." And that sentence reveals more than it appears to. Your soulmate had realized that the promise was bigger than one impulsive message. They did not want to fulfill something meaningful merely because they had been emotionally stirred for 5 minutes. They wanted whatever came next to match the intention behind the promise. So instead of rushing, they began thinking concretely. What did honesty actually look like? Was it a message? A conversation? A meeting? An apology for something left unresolved? A clear acknowledgement of what you meant to them? Maybe all of those things mattered, but one needed to come first. That evening, your soulmate returned to an old place in their memory. A moment involving you that looked insignificant from the outside. Perhaps you were talking about the future. Perhaps you had laughed about something small. Perhaps you had said goodbye normally, never knowing that your soulmate watched you leave with words still unsaid. Your soulmate remembered thinking then, "Next time, I will be more honest." Next time came. Then another next time. And another. The promise kept getting pushed forward. But now a third person knew. Oddly, that did not make your soulmate feel exposed as much as accountable. Their private intention had been brought back into the light. And something in them was tired of postponing sincerity. Here is where the third party's reaction became unexpected. They had initially believed discovering this promise would give them some kind of advantage. Maybe they thought they could understand your soulmate better. Maybe they assumed it would reveal uncertainty. Instead, they realized something else. Your soulmate had already made the important decision emotionally. The only unfinished part was action. "So you really haven't changed your mind?" they asked. Your soulmate looked at them with a steadiness that had not been there earlier. "I've changed a lot," they replied. "That's exactly why I haven't changed my mind." Think about that for a moment. Sometimes feelings survive because people remain frozen in the past. But sometimes they survive because someone grows and still finds the same truth waiting inside them. Your soulmate was not trying to recreate an old version of you or an old version of themselves. They understood that time had moved. You had changed. They had changed. Life had changed. And strangely, that made the promise more meaningful, not less. Because what they wanted now was not a perfect reunion with an old memory. They wanted an honest encounter with who you are today. The third party asked another question, and what if they've moved on from the whole thing? This time your soulmate answered quickly. Then I'll respect that. No drama. No entitlement. No attempt to bend your choices around their feelings. That response mattered. Because the secret promise was never about possessing you. It was about refusing to hide from honesty when honesty became possible. If your path had moved elsewhere, your soulmate wanted the courage to accept reality with grace. But if there was still space for a genuine conversation, they were no longer willing to leave everything inside silence. That realization softened something in them. They were no longer approaching the situation as a person trying to secure a particular outcome. They were becoming someone ready to tell the truth respectfully and allow the truth to breathe. And perhaps this is why the next thing they did surprised even themselves. Your soulmate went back to the phone, but they did not reopen the drafted message. Instead they searched for something else. A date. A place. A detail connected to you. The third party watched closely. "What are you doing?" they asked. Your soulmate smiled, not dramatically, but with the calm expression of someone whose confusion had finally turned into direction. "Keeping my word." Those 3 words changed the energy instantly. But don't assume you know what they meant yet. Because keeping the promise did not mean what the third party initially thought either. There was something your soulmate had quietly been preparing in pieces for some time. Something practical. Something tied to a conversation you once had. A detail you may barely remember mentioning. Your soulmate remembered it. They remembered more than you realized. And now, instead of merely speaking about what you meant, they were considering doing something that would demonstrate they had listened. This was not about an expensive gift or a grand performance. It was personal in a much quieter way. Perhaps you once mentioned a place you hoped to visit. A book you wanted to read. A small dream you had postponed. A song attached to a memory. A cafe, a park, a simple experience you thought would be meaningful someday. Your soulmate had kept that detail tucked away. At first, they did not know why. Now they did. The third party began connecting the pieces and finally understood what the secret promise actually required. It was not simply, "I will tell them how I feel." It was closer to, "If I ever step toward them again, I will show up differently. I will listen. I will be clear. I will not disappear into ambiguity. I will give them something real enough to respond to honestly." That distinction changes everything. Because words can create a beautiful moment, but behavior reveals whether the moment has depth. Your soulmate knew that. And as the night continued, the idea of what came next became clearer. They were not planning to arrive with a rehearsed speech. They were planning one sincere action that could open a door without pushing you through it. A respectful invitation. A truthful message. A chance to talk without pretending the past never happened. A moment that said, in essence, I remembered what mattered, and I'm finally willing to be clear. The third party went quiet when they realized your soulmate had already chosen the first step. When, they asked. Your soulmate looked at the calendar. This is where the story slows, because the answer was not, someday. Your soulmate had spent too long living inside someday. They chose something specific. Not impulsive. Not distant. Specific. They marked it mentally, then began rearranging something in their schedule. A responsibility shifted. A plan was moved. Time was being made deliberately. And that may be the most revealing detail yet. People often say they care. But when something matters deeply enough, they begin creating room for it. Your soulmate was creating room. Still, one unresolved question remained. What exactly were they going to say when that moment arrived? The third party asked them. Your soulmate considered it for several seconds and finally answered, I don't want to give them another mystery. I want to give them clarity. That sentence carried the weight of every unfinished conversation behind it. Your soulmate had understood something important about you. You did not need another confusing signal. You did not need something designed to make you chase for answers. If they stepped into your world again, they wanted to respect your peace. That meant being honest about intention. Honest about hesitation. Honest about the promise. And perhaps most importantly, honest about the fact that you were free to decide what happened next. The third party had expected the discovery of this secret to create tension. Instead, it created movement. Something that had existed privately was beginning to become visible through choices. Yet there was one final detail your soulmate refused to explain. When the third party asked exactly what they were preparing, your soulmate gave a small smile and said, that part is between me and them. The conversation ended not long afterward. But your soulmate remained awake a little longer. Their phone was beside them. The unfinished draft was still there. The date they had chosen was still in mind. And somewhere among old messages was the small detail that had inspired the next step. Your soulmate read it one more time. Then, rather than sending anything impulsively, they created a new note with only a few words at the top. Those words were not a confession. They were a reminder. A reminder of the promise. A reminder of the kind of person they wanted to be when they finally stood in front of you without hiding. And beneath that reminder, your soulmate wrote the first part of what they intend to do next. The third party knows a promise exists. They know your soulmate has made a decision. They know something has now been placed into motion. But they still do not know the detail that matters most. They do not know what your soulmate remembered about you that made them choose this particular next step. And once that detail is revealed, the entire meaning of the promise begins to change. The detail your soulmate remembered was so small that almost anyone else would have forgotten it, yet somehow it had stayed with him through everything, waiting quietly for the exact moment when its meaning would finally become clear. It came from a conversation you may not even think about anymore. Nothing dramatic happened that day. There was no perfect setting, no carefully planned confession, no moment that seemed important enough to preserve. You had simply been speaking honestly, perhaps more honestly than you realized, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation you said something about what matters to you when someone truly cares. You did not ask for grand gestures. You did not describe some impossible standard. You said something far simpler. You said that what stays with you is when someone remembers the little things. The things you mention once and assume will disappear into the air. The small preferences. The quiet hopes. The details hidden between larger conversations. And your soulmate remembered that sentence because, without knowing it, you had explained exactly how you recognize sincerity. Now, after the third party uncovered the secret promise, those words returned to him with unusual clarity. He sat there looking at the note he had created, and suddenly he understood why the next step could not be something generic. If he was truly going to keep the promise he had made about you, then whatever he did next needed to show that he had actually been listening all along. Don't skip, because this is where the third party begins to realize that the promise goes much deeper than they first understood. The following morning, your soulmate woke earlier than usual. For a few seconds everything felt ordinary again. The same room. The same responsibilities waiting. The same familiar rhythm asking him to move forward as though nothing had changed. But then he saw the phone beside him, and the previous night returned all at once. The conversation. The question. The promise. The date he had quietly chosen. And the detail about you that had suddenly given everything direction. He unlocked the screen and opened the old exchange again. There it was. A sentence you had written casually, followed by another message about something you wanted to experience someday. You had not been asking him to make it happen. You had simply been sharing a piece of yourself. At the time, your soulmate responded normally. Maybe even too normally. But later he had gone back and read it again. And again. He had saved the detail without telling you. Not because he had a plan then, but because something inside him thought, remember this. Now he finally knew why. He stared at those words for a long moment before opening his calendar. The third party's question echoed in his mind. What exactly are you waiting for? This time, instead of searching for another excuse, he began making space. He moved one obligation. Checked another date. Looked at a place connected to that old conversation. Then he stopped, because another thought surfaced, one that changed the tone entirely. What if remembering the detail was not enough? What if the real promise required him to acknowledge something more difficult first? Your soulmate leaned back and closed his eyes. He knew what that difficult thing was. There had been a moment between you when he had chosen silence because silence felt safer. You may have sensed it. Maybe you noticed his energy shift. Maybe a conversation suddenly became shorter. Maybe something that had felt warm became uncertain without explanation. You might even have wondered whether you had imagined the connection altogether. But what you did not know was that your soulmate had been standing on the edge of honesty and stepped backward. Not because the feeling had disappeared. Because it had become too real to handle casually. He had told himself that he needed time to understand it. Then time became distance. Distance became habit. And habit became a story he repeated to himself, perhaps it is better not to disturb anything. Yet beneath that story remained the promise. If another honest opportunity comes, I will not hide behind hesitation again. That was why discovering the promise mattered so much. The third party had accidentally forced him to confront the exact behavior the promise was supposed to change. Stay till the end, because what he decided to do next was not simply reach out. First, he decided he needed to understand what he was actually offering you. Not a fantasy. Not a perfect future. Not promises about things neither of you could control. Something much more realistic: clarity. Consistency. A conversation without games. The willingness to listen to whatever your truth might be. That realization changed the message he had been trying to write. His earlier drafts had focused too much on explaining himself. Why he waited. Why he hesitated. Why he had been quiet. Why his feelings were complicated. But suddenly he saw the problem. If he approached you with a wall of explanations, he would be making the moment entirely about his own discomfort. So he deleted almost everything. Then he wrote one sentence that felt different. It acknowledged you. It acknowledged that time had passed. And it made space instead of demanding an answer. He read it several times. For the first time, he did not feel the urge to erase it. Yet he still did not send it. Something else had to happen first. Later that day, the third party contacted him again. They had been thinking about the conversation too. Maybe curiosity had gotten the better of them. Maybe they could not understand how someone who had been so hesitant could suddenly seem so certain. They asked him whether he was really going through with whatever he had planned. His answer came calmly. Yes. But I'm doing it the right way. The third party asked what the right way meant. Your soulmate paused. Then he said something that made them stop treating the promise like a dramatic secret and start seeing it as something far more meaningful. It means I'm not showing up expecting anything. I'm showing up ready to be honest. There is a difference. A huge one. Expectation says, I am doing this so you will give me the answer I want. Honesty says, I am doing this because you deserve to know what is true, and I will respect whatever you choose afterward. Your soulmate had finally begun to understand that difference. And once he understood it, a strange calm replaced much of his nervousness. He was still uncertain. Of course he was. But uncertainty no longer felt like a reason to do nothing. That afternoon, he revisited the place connected to the detail you once mentioned. Maybe it was a quiet cafe you had wanted to try. Maybe it was a bookstore that carried something connected to an interest of yours. Maybe it was simply a peaceful location where you once said you could imagine having a real conversation without noise around you. The exact place mattered less than what it represented. You had shared something genuine, and he had remembered. He stood there for a while, not imagining some perfect scene, but asking himself whether this was truly about you or merely about proving something to himself. The answer came slowly. He did want to prove something, but not that he could win you over. He wanted to prove that he was capable of becoming the person he had promised himself he would be, someone who speaks clearly when clarity matters. Someone who does not disappear when emotion becomes complicated. Someone who can approach another person with sincerity without trying to control the response. And this is where the secret promise revealed another layer. Your soulmate had never promised himself that he would get you back, because he knew you were never something to possess. He had promised that if the chance came, he would give the connection the honesty it had once been denied. That is what the third party had misunderstood. They initially believed your soulmate was preparing some sweeping romantic gesture. In reality, what he was preparing was more mature than that. A moment in which truth could exist without performance. Something important is waiting for you, because while he was standing there thinking through all of this, his phone vibrated. It was the third party again. This time their message contained a question he was not expecting. Does this person even know how much that promise changed you? Your soulmate read it twice. Then a third time. The answer was obvious. No. You did not know. You had seen outcomes without seeing the internal struggle behind them. You may have interpreted hesitation as indifference, distance as certainty, silence as absence of feeling. And perhaps that interpretation was completely reasonable based on what you had been given. Your soulmate knew he could not ask you to judge him based on intentions you never saw. Intentions hidden forever have very little value to the person affected by the silence. That thought hit him deeply. It also changed what he planned to say. He began to understand that the conversation could not begin with, "You should know how much I cared." It had to begin with something closer to, "I understand why you may not have known." That subtle shift mattered. It moved the focus from defending the past to taking responsibility for the lack of clarity. Your soulmate returned home with the feeling that something had settled inside him. Not everything. One final hesitation remained. The fear that contacting you after so much time might interrupt your peace. He respected that possibility enough to take it seriously. So he looked at the draft again and asked himself one question: does this message make space for them to ignore it without guilt? He adjusted the words until the answer was yes. He removed anything that sounded urgent. Removed anything that implied you owed him a response. Removed every phrase that tried too hard to create emotion. What remained was simple. Human. Open. And strangely, once the message became less dramatic, it became more powerful. Because now it sounded like him. Not the version of him trying to say the perfect thing. The version trying to say the true thing. The third party would later learn about this draft, and when they did, their reaction surprised him. They told him it seemed almost too simple after everything that had happened. Your soulmate smiled and answered, "That's the point. Think about that. Sometimes people delay honesty because they believe it needs a magnificent stage. They imagine they must explain every feeling, resolve every misunderstanding, and predict every future possibility before saying the first honest sentence. But perhaps the first honest sentence only needs to open the door." Your soulmate finally understood that. And now the date he had chosen felt closer. Not because the calendar suddenly moved faster, but because he stopped filling the time with imaginary scenarios. He began living normally again. Completing responsibilities. Speaking with people. Moving through the day. Yet underneath everything, there was a quiet awareness: soon, I am going to stop hiding from this. That awareness brought another memory to the surface. One he had not expected. It involved the last time you had looked at him differently. Maybe there was something in your expression he did not understand then. Maybe you had said a simple goodbye that felt heavier than usual. Maybe you had offered him one final opportunity to speak openly without realizing you were doing it. He remembered how close he came to telling you the truth. One sentence had almost escaped. Then he changed the subject. For a long time, he had replayed that moment as evidence that he had missed his chance. But now he saw it differently. A missed chance does not always mean every future chance disappears. Sometimes it simply teaches you what hesitation costs. Your soulmate looked at the note containing the promise again. And underneath it he added another line: do not make them guess this time. That became his new rule. Whatever happened next, he did not want you leaving the conversation wondering what he meant. If he respected you, clarity was part of that respect. The third party, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly curious. They had discovered the promise almost accidentally, but now they could see that their discovery had started something they could not reverse. Not because your soulmate had been manipulated. Because he had been reminded of a decision already living inside him. They asked whether he regretted them finding out. He thought about it carefully. At first, he admitted. Now I think I needed someone to ask me whether I still meant it. And did he? The answer had become obvious through his behavior. He had not forgotten. He had not laughed it away. He had begun reorganizing his choices around the honesty the promise represented. But here is where something unexpected happened. The third party told him they had assumed the promise was about a grand future commitment. Your soulmate corrected them. No. It was about the next right thing. Those words changed the entire conversation. Because sometimes people become overwhelmed when they try to solve the whole future before taking one sincere step. Your soulmate was no longer trying to predict where you and he might be months from now. He was focusing on something far more grounded. Can I show up honestly once? Can I listen without defending myself? Can I accept their truth even if it is not the truth I hope to hear? Can I keep the promise in the way I behave, not merely the words I say? Those questions became more important than fantasies about outcomes. And perhaps that is why what he is about to do next really could change everything, not because it guarantees a particular ending, but because it changes the pattern that kept the truth hidden. The evening before the date he had chosen, your soulmate sat alone again. The phone was nearby. The message was ready. He had read it enough times that every word had become familiar. Yet he did not send it immediately. Instead, he opened the old conversation with you one final time. He scrolled past jokes, ordinary exchanges, moments that seemed meaningless at the time. Then he found the detail he had remembered. The thing you once said mattered to you. Someone remembering. Someone listening. Someone not needing you to repeat what was important. And suddenly he smiled, because he realized the promise was already changing him before you even knew about it. He had become more attentive, more deliberate, less interested in performing certainty, more willing to admit that meaningful connections require courage in ordinary moments. He closed the old messages and opened the new draft. His thumb hovered over the screen. This was the point where old habits usually returned. Overthinking. Delaying. Telling himself tomorrow would be easier. But something was different now. He remembered the third party asking, "What are you waiting for?" He remembered his own answer, "Nothing that matters more than honesty." The message was almost sent. Almost. Then he noticed one line that still did not feel right. It made the message sound as though he were asking you to return to something old. That was not what he wanted. He did not want to drag you backward. So he changed it. He wrote a line that acknowledged something important: neither of you is exactly who you were then. If there is any conversation to have, it should be between the people you are now. That was the final adjustment. The message became lighter after that. More respectful. More real. He read it one last time and finally felt no need to add anything else. Yet what happened in the next few seconds is the part even the third party does not know. Your soulmate did not immediately press send. Instead, he opened another screen on his phone. The place connected to your forgotten detail appeared again. He checked one final piece of information. And when he saw it, his entire expression changed. Something he had assumed would be impossible had unexpectedly become available. Not a miracle. Not some impossible coincidence. Simply an opportunity he had not known existed until he looked. An opening. A date. A practical way to connect the promise with the small thing you once said mattered. He stared at the screen and whispered to himself, almost amused by how simple it suddenly seemed, "That's it." The third party would later ask what had happened in that moment, but your soulmate would not explain. Because this part was no longer theirs to know. It concerned you. Your memory. Your words. Your choice. He saved the information, returned to the message, and placed the phone face down. Strange, isn't it? After all that preparation, he still waited a little longer. But this time waiting was not avoidance. It was intention. He wanted to send the message when he was calm, not caught in an emotional wave. He wanted the next step to begin from steadiness. So he made dinner. Did something ordinary. Let the evening settle. And somewhere during those normal moments, he realized something he had missed throughout this entire journey. The secret promise was never only about approaching you. It was about becoming capable of staying present once the conversation began. Sending a message is easy compared with listening to an honest answer. Making an invitation is easy compared with respecting someone's boundaries. Saying, "I remember," is easy compared with proving through consistent behavior that you truly listened. That was the part your soulmate now understood. And that is the part that changes everything. Because when he finally returned to the phone, he was no longer thinking only about the first message. He was thinking about what kind of energy he would bring after it. No disappearing if the conversation became vulnerable. No vague signals if you asked direct questions. No pretending he had no feelings simply because expressing them felt uncomfortable. At the same time, no overwhelming you with expectations. Balance. That was what he wanted. Honesty without pressure. Care without control. Hope without pretending the future was guaranteed. The message waited on the screen. The cursor no longer blinked because there was nothing left to edit. Your soulmate breathed slowly. And then, just as he was about to make the move he had postponed for so long, another message appeared at the top of his screen. It came from the third party. One sentence. A sentence they had no idea would change what happened next. They had remembered something about you too. Something your soulmate did not know they knew. Something connected directly to the promise. He opened their message, expecting another question. Instead, he found a detail that made him stop completely. The third party had seen something recently. Something involving you. Nothing alarming. Nothing negative. But meaningful enough that your soulmate suddenly realized his timing might not be accidental after all, not because fate was controlling anything, but because there was context he had been missing. The third party wrote, "There's something you should know before you reach out." Your soulmate stared at those words. His prepared message remained beneath them, unsent. The date was chosen. The plan was ready. The promise had finally become action. And now, seconds before he moved forward, a new piece of the story had arrived, one that could completely change not whether he keeps his promise, but how he chooses to keep it.